For over a century, the question of what truly caused the American Civil War has divided the historians of the nation. Most agree that slavery was the central cause, the great wound festering at the heart of the Republic. Others point to the doctrine of states' rights or the competing visions of union and sovereignty. But what is rarely discussed is something older, more primal, the conflict between American aristocracies, rival houses of wealth and power, locked in a silent struggle for supremacy. A feud waged not only with laws and speeches, but with pride, honor, and masculine rage, until compromise collapsed and the nation drowned in blood. America called itself a republic, but behind the ballot boxes and the Constitution lurked something older: aristocracy. On one side stood the lords of cotton. They ruled vast plantations like medieval barons, their wealth measured in acres and in the enslaved human beings they owned. Families like the Calhouns, the Lees and the Davises carried themselves as nobility in a land that pretended not to have nobles. They believed their rule was sanctioned by God and justified by profit. Slavery, thundered former Vice President John C. Calhoun, is a positive good, the most safe and stable basis for free institutions in the world. On the other side rose the barons of iron and finance, not men of fields and whips, but of counting houses, banks and railroads. The Adamses of Massachusetts, the Morgans of New York, the Vanderbilts laying steel tracks across the continent. They worshipped not cotton but capital, not bondage but free labor. To them the future of America lay in industry, in commerce, in a capitalist empire stretching to the Pacific. Between these aristocracies smoldered a rivalry that could not be contained. Each accused the other of tyranny. Each believed only their order could preserve the Union. It was a duel of dynasties, a game of thrones hidden beneath the facade of democracy. America was not just fighting a war of North versus South, it was fighting an aristocratic war of thrones. If America had no kings, the South made its own. Theirs was a nobility without crowns, but with all the trappings of feudal power, vast lands, inherited names, and an army of enslaved laborers to bend the fields to their will. Let's call them the Houses of Cotton. Virginia crowned the Southern nobility. Its dynasties were the Lees, heirs to George Washington's legacy, the Randolphs, whose lineage stretched to the colonial gentry, and the Byrds and Carters, families whose plantations were miniature kingdoms. If Virginia was the South's pride, South Carolina was its fury. Here thundered the Calhouns and the Hampton family, lords of vast estates and thousands of enslaved people, and the Retts, who fanned secession's flame. South Carolina styled itself as the cradle of Southern honor, the first to secede and the loudest to demand disunion. In Mississippi, power lay in sprawling cotton empires. The Davises, with Jefferson Davis himself ascending to Confederate president, embodied the Delta aristocracy. These lords ruled rich bottomlands where cotton was king, their fortunes built on the backs of enslaved thousands. They carried themselves as barons of a feudal frontier. Further west, families like the Butlers of Louisiana mixed politics and plantation wealth. Along the Mississippi River, aristocrats lived in colonnaded mansions, their fortunes feeding both New Orleans markets and Europe's looms. They were the frontier wing of House Cotton, less refined than Virginia's Cavaliers, but just as fierce in defending slavery. They all spoke the language of honor and duty, as if the chivalry of medieval knights had simply crossed the Atlantic and taken root in the New World. But beneath their polished manners and grand parlors was brutality. Their mansions were castles built on bondage, their fields kept green by the crack of whips. Their duels, fought to defend honor, masked a deeper truth. Their power depended entirely on human suffering. By 1860, enslaved people in the South were worth more than all the railroads, banks, and factories of the North combined. To the lords of cotton, slavery was not just an economic system, it was their very identity. The planter class were not apologizing for slavery. They boasted of it as though it were civilization's crown jewel. Yet aristocracies are always paranoid. House Cotton watched the North grow in population, factories and railroads, and felt the noose tighten. They feared the rise of the Free Soil movement, Northerners who demanded that new Western lands be closed to slavery. If slavery could not expand, The planter aristocracy would lose its grip on Congress, its dominance of the Union, and eventually its very survival. Thus they clung to the myth of King Cotton. Southern editors boasted, "No power on earth dares make war upon cotton. Cotton is king." They believed Britain and France, hungry for their white gold, would kneel to their will. With cotton as their sceptre, the South thought itself untouchable. But kings who believe themselves untouchable are the quickest to fall. For all its grandeur, House Cotton was brittle. Its wealth sat on fragile foundations. Enslaved labor, monocrop agriculture, foreign markets. Its culture of masculine pride, of duels and honor codes made compromise impossible. Every threat became an insult, and every insult a call to arms. House Cotton saw itself as the last true aristocracy of America. And when that identity was challenged, it was ready to drag the entire nation into war rather than yield its throne. Cotton is king, they said, but kings who gamble too much often lose their crowns. If cotton ruled the South, then iron ruled the North. Where Southern lords measured their power in acres of land and enslaved bodies, Northern barons counted theirs in factories, banks and steel rails. Let's call them the houses of iron. Its dynasties were the Adamses of Massachusetts, heirs to the Revolution's patrician class, and part of that circle of families known as the Boston Brahmins, which included the Cabots, Lowells, Quinceys, Lodges, and Winthrops. This was New England's self-styled aristocracy of old money, learning and culture. The very name Brahmin, borrowed from the highest caste of India, carried connotations of refinement, education, and noblesse oblige. They were the stewards of Harvard, the patrons of Unitarian churches, the guardians of Puritan legacy. In their own eyes, they were not merely the rulers of Boston, but the rightful guides of the nation itself. If Boston was the mind of House Iron, New York was its heart. On Manhattan, trade and finance became dynasties. The Astors turned furs and real estate into princely fortunes. The Morgans transformed Wall Street into the command post of American finance. The Vanderbilts built railroads and shipping empires that bound the continent in iron. Around them orbited old Dutch families like the Livingstons and Schuylers, descendants of colonial patroons who blended landed wealth with politics. New York was where money moved like blood, industry roared like thunder, and the future of America was minted in coin and contract. Philadelphia added its weight through dynasties like the Biddles in banking and the Whartons in coal and iron. Sober, civic-minded yet powerful, they made the city a northern capital of finance. In Pittsburgh, the furnaces roared. Andrew Carnegie rose from immigrant to steel king, while the Mellons bankrolled empires of industry. Here the Union's cannon and rails were forged. Further west, families like the Tafts of Ohio and kingmakers like Marcus Hanna proved that even the frontier bred its own aristocracy, one tied to coal, iron and political power. Their nobility came not from feudal honor, but from industrial ambition. The creed of House Iron was free labor, commerce and expansion. To them, America's destiny was not the cotton field, but the railroad, not the plantation, but the factory. They saw a republic of immigrants and small farmers, linked by steam engines, defended by tariffs, and crowned by a capitalist empire stretching to the Pacific. And just as the planters believed slavery was God's natural order, the Northerners believed capitalism was history's future. The two houses clashed most bitterly in the Senate. Daniel Webster, voice of New England, thundered, "Liberty and union now and forever, one and inseparable." Across from him, John C. Calhoun, the philosopher of slavery, hissed that the South would sooner destroy the Union than yield to Northern industry. These were not mere debates, they were jousts between lords, each staking a claim to America's throne. Their worlds could not be more different. In the South mansions glowing with candlelight, duels of pistols at dawn, wealth wrung from enslaved hands. In the North, counting houses filled with ledger ships loading in bustling harbours, immigrant workers flooding factories, fortunes made on Wall Street's gamble. And yet, both aristocracies were obsessed with power. The South feared the rise of a so-called money power that would, reduce their nobility to provincial relics. Meanwhile, the North feared a slave power conspiracy, one that threatened to strangle democracy itself. Each believed the other was tyrannical, no question about it. So, as cotton ruled the South and iron ruled the North, America became a nation with two thrones, and only one could endure. If cotton ruled the South and iron ruled the North, then it was their zealots who, truly lit the fires of war. Thrones do not fight alone. Every house has its fanatics, those who speak louder, strike harder, and refuse compromise until honestly all bridges are burned. In the South they were called the fire eaters. Not planters tending to their estates, but aristocratic fanatics who demanded disunion and demanded it now. Robert Barnwell Rhett of South Carolina, remembered as the father of secession. While cautious voices in the South still called slavery a necessary evil, Rhett roared that it was a positive good, ordained by God, essential to civilization, the very cornerstone of Southern greatness. Fierce, unyielding and consumed by pride, he rose as the loudest voice of the fire eaters. William Lowndes Yancey of Alabama, feared and admired as the orator of secession. Where Rhett's words burned like fire, Yancey's thundered like cannon. With a silver tongue and a voice that could sway crowds like a tide, he preached that slavery was not weakness but strength, not shame but destiny. He painted secession as both noble and inevitable. Edmund Ruffin of Virginia, an old man so devoted to slavery that he travelled with his own secession flag, parading it like a holy relic, vowing it would one day fly over a nation free from northern tyranny. Once a respected agricultural reformer, Ruffin abandoned reason for fury, and from his lips poured prophecy of secession and doom. Age sharpened him into steel. His hair was white, his body frail, but his spirit burned with a zeal that shamed younger men. When the moment of reckoning came at Fort Sumter in April 1861, it was Ruffin who claimed the honor of firing the first shot. When the Confederacy finally collapsed, Ruffin refused to live in defeat. Wrapping himself once more in the flag of secession, he put a bullet in his head, declaring with his final words, "I here declare my unmitigated hatred to Yankee rule." Thus he passed into legend. For decades, the fire eaters spread the gospel of disunion until, in their eyes, compromise itself became treason. But the North had its own zealots, the radical Republicans. Men like Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, and Salmon P. Chase. They did not want peace with slavery. They wanted it destroyed, root and branch. To them, the South was not just backward, it was barbaric. When Sumner gave a fiery speech in 1856 denouncing the crime against Kansas, Southern Congressman Preston Brooks answered with his cane. He beat Sumner bloody on the Senate floor until the orator collapsed, his skull fractured. Brooks was cheered in the South as a hero of honor. Sumner became a martyr in the North. The aristocratic feud had spilled into open violence in the very halls of government. Outside Washington, the conflict played out in blood. In the Kansas Territory, Northern abolitionist settlers and Southern pro-slavery raiders turned the prairie into a battlefield. They called it Bleeding Kansas. Towns were burned, men were butchered, and ballots were drowned in blood. These radicals, North and South, were like dueling sorcerers, hurling fire across the Republic. The fire eaters told the South it must secede to survive. The radicals told the North it must abolish slavery to remain free. Moderation was, you might say, scorched from the earth. The aristocracies had their wealth, their houses, their thrones, but it was their zealots who made sure the thrones would clash. And when fire and fire meet, there can be no compromise, only war. Between fire and iron, there were those who wavered, lords torn between kinship and country, wealth and survival. The middle houses, neither all north nor all south, but bound to choose when the storm broke. In the border states, Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee, Virginia, the aristocracy was divided. They had blood ties to House Cotton, but economic ties to House Iron. Many hoped to stay in the Union while keeping slavery intact. They believed compromise could hold. But in America's Game of Thrones, hesitation is a weakness. Virginia's Robert E. Lee stood at the heart of this torment. Offered command of Union armies, he refused. "I cannot raise my hand against my birthplace, my home, my children." Lee's decisions symbolized the choice of the border state aristocracy, loyalty to family and soil over loyalty to the Union. And with that choice, the Confederacy gained its greatest general. Kentucky was even more divided. Some families joined Union armies, others rode with the Confederacy. The Crittenden family became legend. One son became a Union general, while the other son became a Confederate general. There were brothers literally facing each other across battlefields. Abraham Lincoln once said, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." He knew the fate of the Union might rest on these wavering lords. In the North, another faction wavered, the War Democrats. They were not abolitionists. They did not fight to end slavery. But they were Union men, determined that secession must fail. They carried with them the power of the immigrant classes, the Irish in New York, the Germans in the Midwest, groups suspicious of abolition but willing to fight for the Union's survival. These middle houses acted as the balance of power. They gave the Union legitimacy as a broad cause, not merely a crusade of radicals, and they gave the Confederacy strength by bringing in states like Virginia and Tennessee with their manpower and prestige. But once the war began, there was no middle ground left. The border states became bloody frontiers of guerrilla conflict, their towns raided by both sides, their loyalty tested in fire. War Democrats were branded traitors by abolitionists and cowards by secessionists. The middle houses wanted peace. Instead, they were dragged into the war by blood ties and shifting loyalties. And in choosing, they guaranteed that the war would be longer, bloodier, and more all-consuming than either side had first imagined. Every feud of lords eventually leaves the council chamber and takes to the battlefield. For America's aristocracies, that moment came with the election of 1860. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency, House Cotton saw it not as politics but as a coronation, the rise of House Iron to the throne of the Union. Lincoln was no planter, no aristocrat of blood. He was a frontier lawyer, backed by bankers, merchants, and radicals. To the South's nobles, his victory meant the beginning of their extinction. And so the fire eaters got their wish. One by one, southern states seceded, tearing down the Union's banners. Jefferson Davis, planter and slaveholder, was elevated to the presidency of the new Confederacy. For the first time since the Revolution, America had two governments, two thrones, two visions of the future. House Cotton believed they held a secret weapon, King Cotton. They gambled that Britain and France, hungry for southern cotton to feed their mills, would intervene on their behalf. Confederate leaders declared with pride, "No power on earth dares make war upon cotton. Cotton is king." But kings built on vanity often fail. Britain found new supplies in Egypt and India. Europe's working class, inspired by abolitionists, despised the Confederacy's slave empire. The diplomatic crown House Cotton sought never came. Meanwhile, House Iron tightened its grip. Northern railroads moved armies at speeds the South could not match. Banks financed regiments, immigrants filled the ranks. The industrial barons had turned war into machinery. Still, the feud was not decided quickly. From Sumter to Bull Run, from Antietam to Shiloh, the thrones clashed in fire and blood. Aristocrats who once duelled in Congress now duelled with armies. The duel of dynasties had become a national inferno. The planter kings believed their honor and tradition would carry them. The Iron Barons believed their numbers and machines would crush all resistance. Both sides thought they were destined to rule. Both could not be right. Every house war needs champions, figures who embody the pride, the honor, and the fury of their thrones. In America's aristocratic war, dynasties did not just clash in principle. They clashed in flesh. At the center stood Robert E. Lee and Abraham Lincoln, two men who could not have been more different. Lee, the son of Virginia nobility, heir to a family tied to George Washington himself. He was chivalry made flesh, graceful, aristocratic, loyal to honor above all else. For House Cotton, Lee was the sword of their nobility. Lincoln, the son of the frontier, born in a log cabin with no noble lineage, no inherited wealth. His crown was carved from wit, grit, and the backing of House Iron. To Lee, he was a crude upstart. To his allies, he was destiny incarnate. Then came the rulers behind the thrones, Jefferson Davis and Charles Francis Adams. Davis, planter aristocrat and reluctant Confederate president, stiff and defensive, clung to the dignity of the South even as his Confederacy crumbled around him. Across the Atlantic, Adams, son of John Quincy Adams and grandson of John Adams, wielded diplomacy in London. He fought to deny the Confederacy recognition by Britain, telling the Foreign Office in a thunderous warning, "It will be war. War with the United States if Great Britain dares recognize the Southern Confederacy." With those words, he saved the Union from facing Europe's guns. And then there was Thaddeus Stevens, the radical Pennsylvanian who hated the Southern aristocracy with a vengeance. He once said the planter class deserved to be broken, their lands confiscated, their power annihilated. To him, compromise was treason. To the South, Stevens was a fanatic. To the North's radicals, he was a prophet. When all these forces collided and when compromise and negotiation could no longer hold the Union together, the war commenced in fire. April 1861. The conflict began at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, where the proud guns of the South opened fire upon the flag of the Union. The Confederate batteries roared under the command of General Beauregard, while inside the battered fort, Major Robert Anderson held out in vain. The skies thundered with cannon fire until the Union garrison surrendered. Thus, the duel of aristocracies became war. The first true test of arms came at Bull Run, known to Southerners as Manassas Junction. Under General Irvin McDowell, nearly 35,000 Union soldiers marched south, banners snapping in the summer wind. But the Confederates were ready. General P.G.T. Beauregard again commanded the southern line, reinforced by troops under General Joseph E. Johnston, who slipped in from the Shenandoah Valley. And with them rode a stern, pious Virginian who would make his name that day, Thomas Jonathan Jackson. The morning began in chaos and thunder. Union forces struck hard, driving the Confederates back across the rolling fields of Virginia. It seemed for a moment that the South would break. But on Henry House Hill, Jackson's brigade held fast. A Southern officer cried out, "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." From that moment, he was Stonewall Jackson, and the Confederate line stiffened. What followed was a storm of musketry and cannon fire. The Union soldiers, green and untested, faltered under the heat and the fury. Confederate reinforcements poured in by rail, the first great use of trains in American warfare, and the tide turned. McDowell's army broke into panic, retreating in confusion back toward Washington. Civilians who had come to watch fled in terror alongside the soldiers. The field of Manassas was littered with the wreckage of pride. Bodies sprawled in the dust, guns abandoned, flags captured. The Union had tasted its first great shock. The South would not be scattered so easily, and the Confederacy, triumphant, believed it had proven its nobility and courage beyond doubt. But the victory was double-edged. The war, once thought a summer's quarrel, would now stretch on like a curse, long and merciless. The next great shock came at Shiloh on the banks of the Tennessee River, a name that in Hebrew meant peace, but here would be carved into memory as a synonym for slaughter. The Union Army under Ulysses S. Grant rested near Pittsburgh Landing, believing they had time to prepare. But at dawn on April 6, 1862, General Albert Sidney Johnston, commander of the Confederate forces, launched a surprise assault. Rebel troops came surging out of the mist, their battle cries echoing through the trees. Grant's soldiers, many still raw and untested, were driven back in confusion. The forest became a killing ground. Men fought in thickets where the smoke was so thick they could scarcely see the enemy. In peach orchards just beginning to bloom, blossoms drifted down to mix with blood and broken bodies. Cannon roared, musket balls hissed, bayonets clashed in desperate hand-to-hand fighting. The Union line bent under the fury, pressed toward the river, where escape seemed the only hope. For a time, victory seemed within the Confederacy's grasp. Johnston, the South's knightly commander, rode at the front, urging his men forward. But fate struck cruelly. A bullet pierced his leg, severing an artery. Refusing to leave the field, he bled to death beneath a peach tree, his boot filling with blood. His men fought on, unaware that their leader was gone. The Confederacy's best chance at early triumph died with him. As night fell, Grant's army clung desperately to the riverbank, battered but unbroken. Reinforcements, under General Don Carlos Buell, arrived through the darkness, ferried across the Tennessee to bolster the exhausted Union ranks. At dawn, Grant struck back. Now it was the Union that surged forward, their fresh troops driving the weary Confederates into retreat. What had begun as a Southern near-victory turned to ashes. Johnston's army staggered back, leaving the field in Union hands. The cost was staggering, more than 23,000 men dead, wounded or missing in just 2 days. Entire brigades had been chewed to pieces, their ranks obliterated. The battlefield stank of powder and decay, the ground littered with shattered cannon, broken muskets and lifeless bodies sprawled among peach blossoms. If Shiloh was a slaughterhouse, Antietam was a charnel house. It remains the bloodiest single day in American history. In September 1862, Robert E. Lee carried the war into Union soil. His army of Northern Virginia crossed into Maryland, hoping to shatter Northern morale and perhaps win foreign recognition for the Confederacy. Waiting to meet him was General George McClellan, commanding the Army of the Potomac. McClellan was cautious to a fault, but this time he held an advantage. Union scouts had captured Lee's battle plans, wrapped around cigars. At dawn on September 17th, the cannons opened near the town of Sharpsburg. The first clash came in a cornfield. Regiments charged and countercharged until the field was flattened by musketry. Survivors said it was impossible to walk without stepping on bodies. By mid-morning, the fight shifted to the sunken road, a farm lane that became a trench of death. Union soldiers fired volley after volley into Confederates trapped in the ditch until it was so filled with corpses that blood ran like a gutter. From that day it would be called Bloody Lane. On the southern flank, Union troops hurled themselves at Burnside's Bridge, a narrow crossing held by a handful of Georgia riflemen. Time and again the Northerners charged, only to be mowed down and thrown into the creek. At last, sheer weight of numbers pushed them across, but by then Confederate reinforcements had arrived. The Union advance stalled once more. When night fell, 23,000 men lay dead, wounded or missing. Lee withdrew back into Virginia, battered but not destroyed. McClellan, cautious as ever, let him slip away. But the Union claimed a strategic victory. Lincoln seized the moment to declare the Emancipation Proclamation, turning the war into a crusade. After Antietam came the tragedy of Fredericksburg on December 1862, where the Union, under General Ambrose Burnside, hurled wave after wave against Lee's stronghold on Marye's Heights. Confederate rifles and artillery tore through the advancing lines. It was slaughter without purpose. 12,000 Union dead and wounded sprawled upon the frozen ground. A Confederate wrote, "It was murder, not war." House Cotton stood proud, its throne of arms seemingly secure. The duel continued at Chancellorsville, where Lee, outnumbered 2-1, split his army in the face of danger, a masterstroke of audacity. Stonewall Jackson led a night march, falling upon the Union flank like a thunderbolt. The Northern Army, commanded by Joseph Hooker, broke in panic. It was Lee's greatest victory, yet it cost him his night. Jackson was struck by his own men's fire in the darkness and died days later. House Cotton had won a battle, but lost a sword it could never replace. Then came Gettysburg, the high watermark of the Confederacy. Lee once more marched into Union lands, seeking to break the North's spirit. For 3 days, the hills of Pennsylvania shook with fury. On the second day, Union Colonel Joshua Chamberlain held Little Round Top with a desperate bayonet charge, saving the flank. On the third day, George Pickett led his division across an open field in what became Pickett's charge. Union cannon and musket tore them apart. Thousands fell before reaching the stone wall. Lee's proud army staggered back to Virginia, never to invade again. After Gettysburg came the Butcher's War. Lincoln found his general in Ulysses S. Grant, who fought with iron will. He was no aristocrat, no dashing knight, just a quiet man with a rumpled coat and an unshakable resolve. In May 1864, he hurled his army into Virginia in what became the Overland Campaign. The first clash came in the tangled woods of the Wilderness, where gunfire set the forest ablaze. The wounded, trapped in the underbrush, burned alive as men fought blind in the smoke. From there, the armies locked in at Spotsylvania. At a place called the Bloody Angle, soldiers battled for 20 hours. Muskets fired so close they scorched faces, bayonets and rifle butts used when ammunition ran out. Trenches filled with water, mud and blood until the living stood on the bodies of the dead. In June came Cold Harbor. Union soldiers, knowing death awaited, pinned their names to their coats before charging into fortified Confederate lines. In less than an hour, 7,000 fell. Survivors called it nothing short of slaughter. Casualties soared into the tens of thousands. Northern newspapers sneered, calling Grant the Butcher. But he pressed forward without hesitation. "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer," he vowed, and he meant it. Unlike Lee, Grant knew he could afford to lose men. The Union's numbers and industry would always replace them. The Confederacy could not. By autumn, Lee's army was locked in the trenches around Petersburg, starving, shrinking and dying by inches. The romantic image of Southern nobility was broken, ground down beneath Grant's relentless hammer blows. Grant did not retreat. He bled Lee's army white, knowing the South could not replace its dead. While Grant pinned Lee in Virginia, William Tecumseh Sherman carved a scar across the South. If Grant was the hammer, Sherman was the torch. His mission was not merely to defeat Confederate armies, it was to break the very backbone of Southern aristocracy. In the summer of 1864, Sherman besieged Atlanta, the South's rail hub and industrial heart. For weeks, his guns rained destruction until the city cracked. On September 2nd, Atlanta fell. The capture electrified the North, saving Lincoln's re-election and sealing the fate of House Cotton. But Sherman was not finished. He had something far more terrible in mind. In November, he cut loose from his supply lines and began his infamous march to the sea. With 60,000 men, he plunged into Georgia, living off the land and leaving ruin in his wake. Railroads were torn up and twisted into grotesque shapes called Sherman's neckties. Warehouses were torched, mills and foundries destroyed. The South's proud plantations, symbols of its nobility, went up in flames. Sherman waged total war. He believed that to crush the Confederacy, its people must feel the price of rebellion in their own homes. His army moved like a swarm, seizing food, slaughtering livestock, burning barns, leaving behind nothing but ash and smoke. Enslaved men and women flocked to his columns, turning his march into a moving tide of liberation. The march cut the Confederacy in half, from Atlanta to Savannah, a path of destruction 60 miles wide. Witnesses spoke of chimneys, Sherman sentinels, standing alone in seas of rubble where once proud homes had stood. But Sherman was not done. In early 1865, he marched north into South Carolina, the very cradle of secession. There, the fire became vengeance. Columbia, the state capital, went up in flames. Whether set by retreating Confederates or Sherman's men, the result was the same. The birthplace of disunion reduced to embers. By the time he entered North Carolina, Sherman's march had gutted the southern heartland. He had done what no Union army had dared before, carried war to the aristocrats' doorsteps, stripping away their illusions of honor and leaving them with nothing but ruins. Sherman himself wrote, "War is cruelty and you cannot refine it." His cruelty was not random, it was methodical, designed to make the South understand that its cause was hopeless, and it worked. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was a corpse walking. Where Grant broke the South's armies, Sherman broke its soul. The aristocracy itself was devoured in fire. Their mansions, their wealth, their pride reduced to embers. At last, Lee, starving and surrounded, met Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The aristocrat in grey, immaculate on his horse, surrendered to the rough general in mud-stained blue. Grant offered generous terms, letting the Confederates keep their horses to plough their ruined fields. The duel of dynasties was finished. Thus ended the War of Thrones. House Cotton lay in ashes, its lords dethroned. House Iron ruled triumphant, its empire of industry secured. The price was more than 600,000 dead, the Union drenched in its own blood. But from this war of aristocrats was forged the Empire of America. Every Game of Thrones ends with a victor, but the crown is always bought in blood. When the smoke cleared, House Cotton lay in ruins. Plantations burned, mansions stripped bare, fortunes dissolved. The enslaved millions they had claimed as wealth were now free. Their aristocracy, once the proud cavaliers of America, was shattered. Some went into politics under Reconstruction, others into bitterness and myth-making, but their throne of cotton was broken forever. Robert E. Lee, the great knight of House Cotton, surrendered with dignity but no victory. Jefferson Davis, the planter president, fled in humiliation, captured in disguise. The lords of the South had gambled everything on their feudal order and lost it all. In their place rose House Iron. The North's barons of steel, finance and industry emerged crowned as the new rulers of America. Railroads sprawled across the continent. Banks swelled with wartime profits. Factories roared louder than ever. The United States became not just a reunited republic, but an industrial empire. Lincoln did not live to see it. The frontier lawyer who had carried House Iron's banner was struck down by an assassin's bullet. But his vision triumphed, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. His words echoed as House Iron secured its place atop the throne. Yet the victory came at a staggering price. More than 600,000 dead, a nation scarred, families torn apart forever. The feud of aristocracies had dragged ordinary farmers, immigrants and freedmen into its firestorm. America was reborn, but in agony. The Civil War was not merely a war of blue and grey, of North and South. It was a duel of America's aristocrats. House Cotton versus House Iron, tradition versus progress, slave empire versus industrial republic. And in the end, only one throne could stand. House Cotton fell, House Iron ruled, and the age of aristocratic wars gave birth to the American empire of industry.